Ham Radio 2.0 reviews, news, and how-tos of things that are new in amateur radio. My name's Jason. I'm KC5HWB. This is part 2 of the broken down live stream that we recorded with the Hearst Amateur Radio Club in 2020 for people who are wanting to get their very first ham radio call sign, ham radio license, called a technician license. This is the second video in a series of 8. I took those long live streams and I broke them down, took out all the questions, took out all the non-essential parts, and I put just the meat of the video into these broken down pieces. This is part 2, and this is talking about mining the rules of ham radio, what frequencies you get with your very first technician license, and purchasing and choosing your very first ham radio. Check the link in the description below for this book, which we're following during this series, and for the other parts of this video series broken down for you to get your technician license right now before the question pool changes in June of 2022. Good luck.
Okay, so we've kind of gone over what the a little bit of what amateur radio is, what's expected, licensing. We're going to kind of go over some of the rules now. Amateur radio licenses are issued, as I said, by the FCC. All the rules that we operate under as amateur radio operators are in Part 97 of the FCC rules and regulations. So you can just go to the search engine and you can type in FCC Part 97 and download a PDF of everything, or you can go to the ARRL. Who is a kind of the big U.S. amateur radio group. They have links on there and have a lot of information that about Part 97 also. So as we said, the FCC makes and enforces the rules and regulations for the amateur radio service in the U.S. And like I said, they do reserve the right to conduct an inspection of your amateur station at any time. You also have the right to have like a police officer there if you're unsure of why the Men in Black just showed up at your house. But also keep in mind, you really have to do something bad in order to have them show up. You really have to ignore their warnings and not communicate with them how you fix things. I mean, so it's not just, they're not just going to show up at your house. They've got better things to do unless you're really just being a nuisance. Amateur radio licensee is responsible at all times for the proper operation of his or her station and equipment. That includes protecting it from, let's say children. I've got 3 of them here. They should be stored or configured in a manner to prevent authorized use. So at the house, you can do something like disconnect the microphone, the power cord, etc. In your car, remove the microphone. If it's a portable, keep it in a locked cabinet, drawer, or other secured location to where little fingers or any other potential source of interference can access them. One of the things that you want to look for whenever you're asked this question is disconnect the microphone and power cord. That's something that you can do, as well as remove the microphone. Those are in yellow, so those are key points. Things that are not allowed in amateur radio. Transmitting music. Think about your background. If you're driving down the road, you've got your favorite show on, and it's there's music playing in the background, and you key your microphone and you transmit music. You're not going to have the FCC knocking down your door if it's an accident, but if you continually do it, they may have something to say. Manned spacecraft. If you are transmitting music to a manned spacecraft, say like the ISS, it is okay to transmit music. I would say kind of limit it as much as possible, but if it's something that you feel you need to do to a spacecraft, it is okay. We don't broadcast to the general public. Anybody with a scanner or radio can pick up the radio and listen to what's being said. It's not private, but we are not a general broadcast. We're not like a commercial broadcasting station where anybody can listen to it on, in their car or anything like that. It kind of has to have specialized equipment and programming. transmitting of codes or ciphers, encryption is what that is not allowed. Now, there is an exception. We do have amateur radio satellites that are transmitting control data, telemetry, that can be encrypted because you don't want just anybody being able to control your spacecraft. So you are allowed to encrypt that data in order to keep your satellite safe or your space station safe. That's the only time that encryption or cipher, if you're trying to hide something, you're using funny code or something like that, speaking in different way, whatever, it's obscuring the message is not allowed. That's what it is, except for spacecraft or satellite control. We do not cause intentional interference. Excuse me. What this is deliberate attempts to, let's just say, somebody is on a repeater that you have come to not like. It is illegal for you to get your radio and start transmitting. And when you do that, you're essentially locking the repeater up to your radio, blocking others from being able to use the repeater. That's called intentional interference. It's not limited to just that, but it is something that is deliberate. You are deliberately causing a problem, causing interruptions, obstructions, and that will get you a visit by the FCC quicker than anything else. Deliberate and intentional interference is a big no-no. Unidentified transmissions, you can control a remote control model if you want. You will soon hear, if you don't have a radio already, there is a practice on repeaters called kerchunking. People will take their radio and they will key up a repeater to see if they make it. They'll listen for the repeater to come back, and then they go about their merry way. It happens all the time. It is not legal to do that. So if you key up a repeater or a transmitter, just give your call sign. That's all you have to do. Even if it's just for a radio check, you can also say, K5HLY, just doing a radio check, and you're legal to do that. So just unidentified transmissions are something that is not legal. Using indecent or obscene language. Please don't use racial or ethnic slurs, off-color jokes. We are a good community generally. I say generally. We're a really good community that most, you're able to make friends with. So you don't want to. We're not trying to be offensive here. So try to avoid indecent or obscene language. If you wouldn't say it in front of your mom or grandma, please don't say it on the radio. That's generally what I go by. There is no list of bad words, no official list of bad words. So also, go back, transmitting false or deceptive communications. That I think of that as gossip or talking about somebody in order to do harm of some sort. And then business communications, we absolutely cannot provide business communications for even a nonprofit or any kind of business. No communications for hire related to your job. Now, we also do a SwapNet. Some repeaters, some clubs do a SwapNet saying, I have a radio that I would like to sell. It works fine. Here's what I'm asking for. You're letting people know that you have something for sale, and then they can reach out to you offline. You can say, here's how much I want for it. But this is generally a business transaction from an actual company of some sort. So you're okay with SwapNets, just don't you're not a radio for hire company. Pecuniary interest, here are some exceptions. I'm giving this, I'm actually doing this class with you. I am not being paid to do it. I'm volunteering. But if I were a teacher working at a school and I were doing this class, my salary is income. It is a pecuniary interest. As a teacher, I can be paid as just part of the regular classroom duties to teach this class. That's the only time that I can actually be paid to teach this, is because I am a professional teacher and I'm doing this as part of my class. Public health officials who use amateur radio for external hospital communications during emergencies. This is very common here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Every hospital has amateur radio in it. I mean, we've got pretty redundant communications systems for all public service, but you never know. I mean, if something goes down, something happens, they have the amateur radio to fall back. Not making money from that, though. Police, fire, and emergency management personnel who have amateur radio in their emergency operations center. This is also very common. Just about, probably, if not all, emergency operations centers for each city in the Dallas-Fort Worth and surrounding areas will have amateur radio in it, provide storm spotters or backup communications. Again, they're not making money on that. So these are just some of the examples where a teacher can be paid, but people who are being paid to do their job but not making money on the amateur radio itself is okay. Essentially, we are licensed to communicate with each other. Two-way communications. One-way communications, that's like testing of equipment, RC model boats, aircrafts, robots, beacons. There are stations out there that just all they do is beacon Morse code nonstop. And then position reports, which we'll talk about, I believe, tomorrow or Saturday. If you're going to do an RC aircraft or boat or robot, your transmitter, little transmitter box, will have to have a label on it with your call sign, and then you're limited to 1 watt of power. Always identify with your call sign. So essentially, hams, let me go down the line. Two-way communications with other hams on amateur frequencies do not include just communicating with the general public. Anybody can be a ham. But like I said, we don't broadcast to the general public. We don't use our license to talk to CB operators. They are not authorized to legally talk on amateur radio. And then other radio services, whether that's FRS, GMRS, businessman, or other public service type things. There is one exception. Each year there is the Armed Forces Day communications test. So communications with armed forces during this time is allowed, and you can just find information online about that. That's not something we're going to cover here, other than this is an exception where you can communicate with another service itself. So transmitter power, while not exceeding the maximum power permitted on a given band, use the minimum power necessary to carry out the desired communications. Most bands, and I say most, not all of them, have a power rating of about 1,500 watts. Some down in the HF are limited far less than that, but 1,500 is generally the maximum in general. If you're transmitting that much power, you might have a reason to be doing that. If you use the minimum power necessary, it gives you 2 benefits. It reduces interference. So if you are having a conversation with somebody, let's say a friend a couple streets over, and 1 watt is perfectly fine to get from your house to theirs, there's no reason why you should have to run 100. It reduces interference, because if you're talking to somebody right down the road and you're at 100 watts, well, you're not just talking to that person down the road, you're also talking to the person another city, maybe even in another county. So, and that's completely unneeded. So use only what you need. If you can carry out a conversation on 5 watts in your mobile, that's perfectly fine. We don't need to try and just try and talk to the moon. Another thing it does is if you the lower the power on transmit on your portable radio, the longer your battery life will last. The higher the power, the more it takes, and your battery will degrade quickly. Not degrade. Your battery will drain quickly. So just use the minimum power necessary. There's no reason to go overkill. So this is basically the very, very basic layout of how we transmit. So the microphone is going to convert voice into electrical waves. The transmitter can convert those electrical waves into radio signals, and then the antenna radiates the radio signals. So that's a basic way that you actually transmit. And then when you receive, the antenna captures the radio signals, and then it will convert those radio signals into electrical signals, and then the speaker will convert those back into sound waves, analog sound waves. So that is the basics of a transmitter and a receiver. So we're going to get just a little bit more technical here. An electromagnetic radio wave, and a radio wave is also known as an electromagnetic wave. It travels at 300 million meters per second, which is also the speed of light, a little higher than, or a little lower than that, but 300 million is what we go by. You're going to want to memorize 300 million or 300, because that's going to be an important number in your ham career. So if you look at the little squiggly line right there, that's a sine wave. That is basically a simplified version of what a radio wave would look like. It's just a simple up, down, up, down, up, down of electromagnetic wave. You may have heard me call radio frequencies RF. That's just, we love our acronyms in amateur radio, so we'll call it RF instead of radio frequency, because it's just shorter. Radio waves are composed of both an electric and a magnetic field. It is non-ionizing, so it's not like X-ray. So that is a people used to panic about a cell phone being close to your head causing cancer. RF energy is not ionizing. It will cause heating if anything. So 300 million meters per second, also known as the speed of light. You want to hold on to that because we're going to talk about it again in just a second. Radio waves are usually described by frequency and wavelength. We are going to calculate both frequency and wavelength here in just a minute, and you'll be surprised that it's actually easier than you think. So one way to describe the unit of frequency is by hertz. Now, one way you can think about this, if you look at this sine wave right here, up, down, positive, negative, that's just, that's electricity works the same way. So down, up, and pause. That is considered one cycle, 1 hertz. The power company will use a large alternator to produce the power at its generating stations. The AC supplied to your home goes through 60 cycles, so 60 up downs, shifting from positive to negative and back to positive again each second. So the electricity from the power company has a frequency of 60 hertz because it has gone down, up 60 times in 1 second. So that is how you measure a frequency and be able to tell what the frequency is. In this one, let's just say this is 1 second here from between A and B. That would be 1 hertz. So they are electric and magnetic fields that cycle back and forth very fast. Hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions a second. So 1,000 cycles is a kilohertz. So this is kind of a metric measurement here. So a kilohertz, that is 1,000 up, down in 1 second. 1 million cycles is a megahertz. So we call that megahertz. It does continue to go up from there, gigahertz, terahertz, petahertz, just depending on what the frequency is. So it's just the up down motion in a given time period. Another thing that we talk about is wavelength. So the lower the wavelength, the longer the the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. So if you look at this top one here, you have 1 hertz, and then compare that to the 1 hertz down on the bottom one. That wave is not as compressed, and so that wavelength is how long it takes them to go from center up, down, and back to center. However long that is what we call the wavelength. The higher you go in frequency, the shorter the wavelength. So if you think about amateur radio, when we talk about 6 meters or 2 meters or 70 centimeters and so on, those are actual wavelength in meters. And so 6 meters is a longer wavelength than 2 meters, which is a longer wavelength than 70 centimeters, which means you can usually you can talk further on a lower frequency. And that's one of the reasons that you can generally talk worldwide on the HF, the 30 megahertz and below frequencies. So wavelength is measured in meters, and this is a representation. You can see that the gap here on this lower frequency than this higher frequency right there. So when we, this is another representation of wavelength here. So the wavelength cycles, positive, negative, positive, negative. This is going to be the distance for that one cycle go positive, negative, back, start. It's basically a sine wave. That is going to be your wavelength. Now, it's still going to travel however far in 1 second, but this is just how long that cycle actually is. We call that the frequency. So I told you to memorize that 300 number. The way that we calculate frequency and wavelength is using that 300. So let's just take an example here. We want to know the wavelength of a frequency. Let's just take 146 megahertz. So that's 146 million hertz, 146,000,000. The speed of light is 300 million. So we want to simplify that, knock off those zeros, additional zeros, and we're going to divide 300 by 146. And that's going to give us our wavelength in meters. And that's generally going to be right around 2 meters. If you want to fill in, let's say 50 megahertz, 300 divided by 50 will give you a wavelength of about 6 meters. So that's where that, when we talk about meters regarding wavelength or bands, that's where it actually comes from, is talking about that wavelength, that calculation. Then you can also do to find the frequency. So if I say I want to know what 6 meters is, what the frequency of 6 meters is, let me take 300 divided by 6, and that's going to give me about 50 megahertz. And so you can use those. You can use that 300 number to find out both of those. If I give you some random number like, oh goodness, let me say like 23 centimeters. Well, you can pop those numbers in there, and you can get the frequency, and then you can also turn around and get that wavelength for that band also. We generally round them to the nearest meter, just to keep things simple. So radio frequencies are divided into 3 groups. Actually, there are more groups, but for this, this is what we're interested in here. HF, or high frequency, that is 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz, from 3 to 30 megahertz. VHF, very high frequency, that ranges from 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz. So 3 to 30, then 30 to 300, and then on top of that, UHF, ultra high frequency, is 300 to 3000 megahertz. So they're just different ranges. We keep going higher and higher, but for this instant right now, that's really not important. You can look those up on your own at another time. But this is what you need to memorize: HF and the range, VHF and the range, and UHF and the range. There's not really an easy way to or a memory jogger for it, so you just kind of have to memorize it. Just say it over and over, or whatever it takes for you to memorize, because it's one of those things that you have to memorize. So this is going to be your operating frequencies. You're going to get multiple 6 meters and higher. So if you look at this, 6 meters, 50 megahertz to 54 megahertz, that's in the VHF range. This is something that whatever it takes for you to memorize these, there's not a memory jogger for this other than just repetition. So if you look at this, 50 megahertz to 54 megahertz, that's 6 meters. We did that calculation a minute ago. To get, you can flip between those two numbers there. 2 meters, 144 to 148 megahertz. So that is, you can do that calculation also to back and forth to get those numbers. If you look at the very beginning, or at the very start of those, they have a small area of what we call mode restricted subbands. Those are exclusively, in that range right there, exclusively for CW, or Morse code as we call it. That Morse code is no longer required to get your ham license, but because it's no longer required, it's actually more popular than it has ever been, because you're not required to learn it. More people are interested in it. So you want to memorize that, and it's usually pretty close to the same in most of the bands that have a subband for Morse code. In that first little 100 kilohertz area right there, that mode restricted subband for Morse code. 1.25 meters. That's a long name. We like to call it the 220 band, or just 220. This also has a subband, a mode restricted subband for point-to-point digital message forwarding, which is kind of like pagers, like the old school pagers. That's kind of what it is. So that has a mode restricted subband for that. It goes from 219 to 225. There is a gap in there. Part of that was sold off to UPS recently. So there is a little bit in the beginning, kind of a no-go zone, and then the rest of the band also. But you need to know 219 to 225 is going to be that important frequency. And again, like I said, you have to memorize these. We keep going up. 70 centimeters, 23 centimeters. We will oftentimes call the 70 centimeter band, we'll just call it 440. That is not uncommon. It's a 30 megahertz span. 420 to 450 is that frequency range. And then the 20 centimeters, if you look at this, that's 1240 megahertz, also known as, if you're going to do the math, 1.24 gigahertz to 1300 megahertz, or 1.3 gigahertz. It's just however you want to look at that. That's some pretty good. That is actually prime real estate right there in the RF spectrum that many companies and businesses would like to have their hands on. But we get that special treatment because we are working to enhance the radio frequency art and history. 446.00 megahertz. That is what we call the national calling frequency. This is a frequency that no matter where you go in the country, generally you can flip over to 446.0, throw out your call sign, and oftentimes get some sort of a response. 2 meters also has one. It's very, very popular, 14652. But for this instance here, 446.0 is the national calling frequency. Kind of, I don't want to call it the equivalent to channel 19 on CB, but it serves kind of that same function. That's where most people think of on CB is going to channel 19 and listening. On 70 centimeters or 440 band, 446 is kind of that frequency that you go to. Some frequencies in the ham bands are available for use for us as a secondary basis. We can use the frequency as long as there is no interference to the primary users. If there is interference, the ham must stop transmitting and fix the cause of the interference. And that may just be transmitting. Secondary basis, I'll give you an example of this on the 70 centimeters or 440 band. In a certain area on that band, we are considered secondary. And I don't know if the military still uses it, but they are primary. So if you're talking on there at some point and you hear something going on that's clearly not amateur radio and it doesn't sound like some sort of just malicious interference, it could possibly be the military or whoever it is that has primary permissions to that frequency, and you have to stop if you cause interference on there. Somebody can complain to the FCC, and you could get some sort of an advisory or warning letter. So we are secondary basis. I've been a ham for 21 years, and I have never heard military or anybody on the 440 operating as a primary. So this is a confusing subject for some, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to explain bandwidth. So bandwidth is going to be the amount of space, the radio frequency spectrum, in that spectrum that a signal occupies. We call that the bandwidth. The bandwidth of a transmission is determined by the information rate, how much information you can actually transmit on the carrier of a purely continuous unmodulated carrier. How much actual information can be transmitted. So the easiest way I came to think about this is think about water hoses. Think about like one of those little plastic hoses in a fish tank. It's very small amount of water can get through it. The next one could be a water hose, and then the next one could be a fire hose, and then continue going all the way to the amateur television down here would be something along the lines of a main water line or something. The bandwidth is going to be the amount, in that example, the amount of water that can go through that line. Same thing happens with RF. CW is like that little water line in an aquarium. It's very, very, very narrow, 500 hertz. It's not even a kilohertz wide. RTTY, RTTY, 700 hertz. It's next. Sideband, single sideband voice on HF is generally 2 to 3 kilohertz. So 2,000 to 3,000 hertz. And that's, like I said, that's the amount of information that is sent on that carrier. FM is 10 to 15, actually 10 to 25 kilohertz. So that's one of the reasons that if you go from listening to an HF radio to listening to an FM conversation on a handheld radio or a mobile radio, the FM sounds much richer just much fuller. There's a wider spectrum of information that is sent. The smaller amount of bandwidth that a service uses, like CW, it's not gonna be rich and just sound really really well. Amateur television is basically just television like you have in your living room. It's just television. You set up a camera and you're transmitting over over amateur radio, 6 megahertz. There's a lot of information in there that gets transmitted in order to have the picture and the audio. So more information means more bandwidth, and that is the best way that I have thought about way to think about bandwidth. It's just the amount of how much information can be transmitted or can be sent. We call that NTSC on the amateur television, and that is still pretty popular. It's usually in the higher bands. Just television is what it is. Long distance television sometimes. CW is the narrowest. Morse code is what that is. That is sometimes called the mode that gets through when nothing else does, because it's just such a fine amount of information that has to be sent. It generally will get through when nothing else will. So we talked about bandwidth, and one thing that you have to be careful about is not to operate too close to the edge of the band. So when you see a frequency of, let's take 54 megahertz FM voice here. Well, like I said, FM is 25 kilohertz. That's how wide it is. Well, the 54 megahertz, that is your kind of your center line, right down the middle of that. That's where your carrier is. So that sine wave is actually going out off of that center point. And so if you position yourself at 54 megahertz and you're operating FM, half of your signal is actually going to be outside of the legal band the band that you're transmitting. You are transmitting illegally, so you kind of have to do the calculation. And each band is going to be different depending on the mode that you use. So we're not going to go in detail on different modes, but you have to be aware. You don't want to set yourself up on the band edge, because you might actually be transmitting outside of the band itself. So let's think of we're still talking about bandwidth here. So there's always these little snap, crack, popple, snap, hiss, pop, all this stuff that's going on at all times in radio. Always, it's always there. This is what your radio is listening to. Your radio is listening to everything all at once. It receives everything, regardless what it is. It's later then discriminated down into what you will actually hear. So this is it's basically wide open. It's listening for not only what you want, but it also hears everything else you don't want to hear. Most HF radios and some high-end VHF radios, that could do sideband. You can kind of turn that down. You can turn that bandwidth down to where you're not just hearing every single bit from band edge to band edge. You can turn that down and like this. And so what we're doing here, we're turning that bandwidth down. We're kind of focusing in a little bit more. So that stuff that's outside of the box, we don't hear. Well, we can continue. We can keep narrowing that bandwidth down. We can narrow it down to where we're still picking up a few crackles and pops, but all that other stuff out there is gone. We've kind of eliminated that, and we are just hearing that signal that we want to hear. That is one of the reasons that your radio will come with a bandwidth knob. That way you can kind of tune all that out, because especially with the HF, it's pretty cramped spaces down there. It's not uncommon to find somebody who might be very close to you in frequency, and kind of when they start transmitting, they kind of bleed over onto you because you're listening to everything. Well, you can narrow that down into a much finer receive frequency there, bandwidth, and that way you can kind of notch them out. A narrow bandwidth mode like SSB single sideband is better for long distance communications. We are going to talk about single sideband in a couple of days. I believe on Saturday. It might be tomorrow. But that's one of the things that you use. And if you can kind of narrow down that bandwidth to just what you want to hear, you'll end up your ears will thank you, because it's getting rid of a lot of the extra stuff out there. So ham radios come in many shapes and sizes. This is not an official rule, but it's kind of something that you probably will hear. Generally, the more knobs and buttons and screens that a radio has, usually the more expensive it will be. That one that's in the top left corner up here, I believe, I don't know what, that's a Yaesu of some sort. That radio is, oh gosh, I would easily say thousands of dollars. The ICOM that is right here, that's a sub 1,000. That's a great radio to start off with. These are mobiles. This is a mobile HF. This is a mobile VHF, UHF, dual band. This is going to be another HF radio. And then these are just some smaller, older handy talkies, HTs as we call them. So they all have their purpose. And the way you can differentiate those is generally a base transceiver has the capability of transmitting 1 to 200 watts. That's not uncommon. They're usually large, and because they're large, they will sometimes use AC power. A lot of radios are going away from AC power and kind of using DC power now. So you have to have some sort of an external power supply or battery to run them. They do require an external antenna, and they are sometimes the antennas can be large depending on what frequency. Generally have HF, only HF, or HF, VHF, and UHF, all modes, CW, sideband, and FM. So it basically does everything in the toy box. Mobile transceivers can go from 35 to 100 watts. They're a lot smaller. They will use the power from your car battery. They can also do HF or HF, VHF, UHF, and then all mode, just like the big base ones. But they don't use much power. They also may not have as sensitive as receivers, just because a base transceiver is designed to really pull out anything that it can hear. A handheld transceiver is just like your cell phone. It's small size, has internal batteries, has an attached antenna, typically 3 to 5 watts. There are some now that will do a little bit more, 10 watts. Typically VHF and UHF only. Some probably 99%, if 99.5% are FM only. You might be able to find something that does something else, like digital. Digital as far as like APRS, which is position reporting. They'll also do like a digital trends, a digital trend, turning your voice into a digital. So that's the big difference there. Usually size going all the way down to handheld from something that's installed permanently at your house. Now here in the DFW area, and I would assume in most others, there's probably dozens, if not tens of hundreds of repeaters in a certain area. There is no way that you can memorize every single one, because you would have to memorize the transmit frequency, the receive frequency, the CT, CSS access tone, or PL tone, as some refer it. your transmit power level. Most radios, including the cheap Chinese ones, will have memories. So what you do is you program the radio with the repeaters that you want. You set all the information. You set the frequencies, the access tones, the power levels, and you store that in the radio, and then you can just use the knob on top or wherever the knob is to just navigate through and find the repeater that you want. Most newer radios, including the inexpensive ones, the Baofeng and the Titera and things like that, you can do alphanumeric names, so you don't even have to see the frequency that you're on anymore. You just say, in the case that I have on my little handheld right here, I can just say go to Hurst VHF or Hurst UHF, and then everything is there. Everything I need to access that repeater is there. So that's what you would put into the memories in order so the radio can memorize it and you don't have to. So if you get a mobile or radio or even a base radio, they may take DC power instead of AC power. And if that's the case, you're going to need a power supply. There's different kinds of power supplies. Some of them give you more benefits than others. In this case, a regulated power supply keeps the output voltage steady regardless of the variation in the input voltage and protects the equipment from voltage fluctuations. So this is saying it can go, 117 volts up to 124. Well, this power supply will regulate that to 12 volts. That way, no matter what your AC line is doing at the house, it's going to put out 12 volts. These are generally more expensive. They're better power supplies, but they're generally more expensive. You can get a power supply that's cheaper, a switched power supply. They'll provide a good solid voltage out too. But a regulated power supply is the kind that will kind of act as a filter. It will regulate that power to take that fluctuation out. So that will be something that you have to have for a radio that requires DC. What is the unit of frequency? We're going to do a little short review here. So what is the unit of frequency? We've talked about this a little bit. It's going to be the hertz. The Henry and Farad are electronic components. The Tesla is a car and a coil. We're not going to worry about that. So we're interested in hertz. Hertz is what we measure our frequency, our radio frequency in. And which of the following occasions may an FCC licensed amateur station exchange messages with a U.S. military station? Briefly talked about this. It happens annually. And it is going to be during an Armed Forces Day communications test. Which of the following is a result of the fact that the amateur service is secondary in some portions of the 70 centimeter band? I gave you an example of that, of why we are secondary. And these are long answers, so I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds. I see in the chat, A is very popular. Good job. U.S. amateurs may find non-amateur stations in, there's a delay there, and must avoid interfering with them. What amateur band are you using if you're transmitting on 223.5? So you can either do the calculation or if you have it memorized, either way. It's been around for a long time, and it's starting to see more popularity as more radios come out. It's 1.25 meter band, the 220. It's a very quiet band, very, very nice. A lot of radios are starting to come out with that. What is the national calling frequency for FM simplex operations in the 70 centimeter band? talked about that briefly. And it's kind of like that channel 19 on CB. It's the 446.00 megahertz. So, yeah, I don't know if the current material will also ask about the 2-meter band. The 2-meter band is 146.5. So, in this case, 70 centimeters, 440 is 446. And if that asks for 2 meters, well, you can say that's 140 something megahertz, and 146.52 is its answer. Hope I didn't confuse people there. In which of the following circumstances may the control operator of an amateur station receive compensation for operating the station? So if I am a teacher and it's part of my classroom material, when the communication is incidental to the classroom instructions and an educational institution, that is the only time I can be compensated for using amateur radio. Which of the following is a permissible use of the amateur radio service? Answer is D, allowing a person to conduct radio experiments and to communicate with other licensed hams around the world. Again, we don't provide low-cost communications for businesses, and we don't earn additional income for passing messages. We definitely don't broadcast music and videos. That's a big no-no. So D is the answer to that one. When are you allowed to operate your amateur station in a foreign country? Answer is A, when the foreign country authorizes it, and you will have to look up a reciprocity agreement between the two countries. I'm sure you can find some of that on the ARRL or arrl.org. I believe they may have some information on that there. So if you're going to travel abroad, you can take your radio with you. I've done that before and use it. Just make sure that you're following their rules. When is an amateur station required to transmit its assigned call sign? I want to read these kind of closely because the wording is very limited on what's different. So you want to identify at least every 10 minutes. That's going to be the maximum number. So at least every 10 minutes during and at the end of the communication. And this is going to be a little conversion. Which of the following frequency is equal to 28,400 kilohertz? Okay, that answer is going to be 28.4. So we just basically shifted the decimal place to the left. 28.4 megahertz is what that converts to. What is the approximate bandwidth of a single sideband voice signal? We talked about this while we were in the bandwidth section. The answer is going to be 3 kilohertz, B. That is going to be how much information can be sent on that radio carrier. What type of wave carries radio signals between transmitting and receiving stations? This is one of my favorite questions. The answer is electromagnetic. That is what makes up an RF signal. Magnetostrictive. That's still one of my favorite answers that out there, but it is very much wrong. And then surface acoustic, we don't hear RF signals. So electromagnetic, that's what you need to know. What are the two components of a radio wave? What are the two components of an electromagnetic radio wave? That will be C, electric and magnetic fields. And how fast does a radio wave travel through free space? It's going to be at the speed of light. We round that up to 300 million meters per second. So it go real fast. What is a way to enable quick access to a favorite frequency on your transceiver? That's going to be store it in the frequency in a memory channel. That way you don't have to remember hundreds of frequencies and offsets and tones and everything that comes with it. So we are officially done with session 1